Strange, but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. On the night and early hours of February 20th and 21st, 1954, while on a vacation to Palm Springs, California, President Dwight Eisenhower went missing and allegedly was taken to Edwards Air Force Base for a secret meeting. When he showed up the next morning at a church service in Los Angeles, reporters were told that he had to have emergency dental treatment the previous evening and had visited a local dentist. A man later appeared at a function that evening and was presented as the dentist who had treated Eisenhower. The missing night and morning has subsequently fueled rumors that Eisenhower was using the alleged dentist visit as a cover story for an extraordinary event. The event is possibly the most significant that any American president could have conducted, an alleged first contact meeting with extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base, and the beginning of a series of meetings with different extraterrestrial races that led to a treaty that was eventually signed. There is circumstantial and testimonial evidence supporting Eisenhower's meeting with extraterrestrials and the start of a series of meetings that culminated in the signing of a treaty with a different group of extraterrestrials. The most intriguing are circumstances surrounding Eisenhower's alleged winter vacation to Palm Springs, California, from February 17th through the 24th, 1954. First, the vacation for the president was announced rather suddenly and came less than a week after Eisenhower's quail shooting vacation in Georgia. According to UFO researcher William Moore, all this was quite unusual and suggested that there was more to the one-week visit to Palm Springs than a simple holiday. Second, on the Saturday night of February 20th, President Eisenhower did go missing, fueling press speculation that he had taken ill or even possibly died. In a hastily convened press conference, Eisenhower's press secretary announced that Eisenhower had lost a tooth cap while eating fried chicken and had to be rushed to a local dentist. The local dentist was introduced at an official function on Sunday, February 21st, as the dentist who had treated the president. Moore's investigation of the incident concluded that the dentist's visit was being used as a cover story for Eisenhower's true whereabouts. Consequently, Eisenhower was missing for an entire evening and could easily have been taken from Palm Springs to the nearby Edwards Air Force Base. The unscheduled nature of the president's vacation, the missing president, and the dentist cover story provide circumstantial evidence that the true purpose of his Palm Springs vacation was for him to attend an event whose importance was such that it could not be disclosed to the general public. A meeting with extraterrestrials may well have been the true purpose of his visit. The first public source alleging a meeting with extraterrestrials was from Gerald Light, who in a letter dated April 16, 1954 to Meade Lane, the then director of Borderland Sciences Research Associates, claimed he was part of a delegation of community leaders to an alleged meeting with extraterrestrials at Edwards Air Force Base. In a subsequent article, Meade Lane described Light as a gifted and highly educated writer and lecturer who was skilled both in clairvoyance and the occult. Light was a well-known metaphysical community leader in the Southern California area. The alleged purpose of him and others on the delegation was to test public reaction to the presence of extraterrestrials. Light described a meeting of panic and confusion of many of those present, discussions of the emotional impact of the alleged landing, and the tremendous difference of opinion on what to do in terms of telling the public and responding to the extraterrestrial visitors. Plausible descriptions of what may have occurred. Indeed, the psychological and emotional impact Light describes for senior national security leaders at the meeting is consistent with what could be expected for such a life-changing event. There are a number of other sources alleging an extraterrestrial meeting at Edwards Air Force Base that corresponded to a formal first contact event. These sources are based on testimonies of whistleblowers that witnessed documents or learned from their insider contacts of such a meeting. These testimonies describe what appears to be two separate sets of meetings involving different extraterrestrial groups who met either with President Eisenhower and/or with Eisenhower administration officials over a short period of time. The first of these meetings, the actual first contact event, did not lead to an agreement, and the extraterrestrials were effectively spurned. The second of these meetings did lead to an agreement, and this has apparently become the basis of subsequent secret interactions with extraterrestrial races involved in the treaty that was signed. There is some discrepancy in the sequence of meetings and where they were held, but all agree that a first contact meeting involving President Eisenhower did occur, and that one of these meetings occurred with his February 1954 visit to Edwards Air Force Base. The first version of Eisenhower's meeting is described by one of the most controversial whistleblowers to ever have come forward into the public arena to describe an extraterrestrial presence. William Cooper served on the Naval Intelligence Briefing Team for the commander of the Pacific Fleet between 1970 through 1973 and had access to classified documents that he had to review in order to fulfill his briefing duties. He describes the background and nature of the first contact with extraterrestrials as follows. In 1953, astronomers discovered large objects in space which were moving toward the Earth. It was first believed that they were asteroids. Later evidence proved that the objects could only be spaceships. Project Sigma intercepted alien radio communications. When the objects reached the Earth, they took up a very high orbit around the equator. There were several huge ships, and their actual intent was unknown. Project Sigma and a new project, Plato, through radio communications using the computer binary language, was able to arrange a landing that resulted in face-to-face contact with alien beings from another planet. Project Plato was tasked with establishing diplomatic relations with this race of space aliens. In the meantime, a race of human-looking aliens contacted the U.S. government. This alien group warned us against the aliens that were orbiting the equator and offered to help us with our spiritual development. They demanded that we dismantle and destroy our nuclear weapons as the major condition. They refused to exchange technology, citing that we were spiritually unable to handle the technology which we then possessed. They believed that we would use any new technology to destroy each other. This race stated that we were on a path of self-destruction, and we must stop killing each other. Stop polluting the Earth. Stop raping the Earth's natural resources, and learn to live in harmony. These terms were met with extreme suspicion, especially the major condition of nuclear disarmament. It was believed that meeting that condition would leave us helpless in the face of an obvious alien threat. We also had nothing in history to help with the decision. Nuclear disarmament was not considered to be within the best interest of the United States. The overtures were rejected. The significant point about Cooper's version is that the humanoid extraterrestrial race was not willing to enter into technology exchanges that might help weapons development, and instead was focused on spiritual development. Significantly, the overtures of these extraterrestrials were turned down. Confirmation that the first contact meeting involved extraterrestrials who were effectively spurned for taking what might be considered a principled stand on technology assistance and nuclear weapons comes from the son of a former Navy commander who claimed that his father had been present at the first contact event on February 20th and 21st, 1954. According to Charles L. Suggs, a retired sergeant from the U.S. Marine Corps, his father, Charles L. Suggs, was a former commander with the U.S. Navy who attended the meeting at Edwards Air Force Base with Eisenhower. Sergeant Suggs recounted his father's experiences from the meeting in a 1991 interview with a prominent UFO researcher. Charlie's father, Navy Commander Charles Suggs, accompanied President Ike along with others on February 20th. They met and spoke with two white-haired Nordics that had pale blue eyes and colorless lips. The spokesman stood a number of feet away from Ike and would not let him approach any closer. A second Nordic alien stood on the extended ramp of a biconvex saucer that stood on tripod landing gear on the landing strip. According to Charlie, there were B-58 Hustlers on the field even though the first one did not fly officially till 1956. These visitors said they came from another solar system. They posed detailed questions about our nuclear testing. Another whistleblower who confirms that first contact involved an extraterrestrial race being spurned for their principled stand on technology transfer is the son of the famous creator of the Learjet, William Lear. John Lear is a former Lockheed L-1011 captain who flew over 150 test aircraft and held 18 world speed records, and during the late 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s was a contract pilot for the CIA. Lear developed a close relationship with CIA Director William Colby, who was in charge of covert operations in Vietnam before becoming DCI. According to Lear, there had indeed been a warning from another race prior to an agreement being eventually signed, and he claimed they visited Edwards and the following occurred. In 1954, President Eisenhower met with a representative of another alien species at Edwards Air Force Base. This alien suggested that they could help us get rid of the Greys, but Eisenhower turned down their offer because they offered no technology. Cooper's and Lear's idea of more than one extraterrestrial race interacting with the Eisenhower administration is supported by other whistleblowers, such as former Master Sergeant Robert Dean, who, like Cooper, had access to top-secret documents while working in the intelligence division for the Supreme Commander of a major U.S. military command.
I arrived in the summer of '63 and I was assigned to the Operations Division. I was further assigned to what we call SHOC, the War Room, the Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. And at that time I was given a cosmic top-secret clearance, which was and still is the highest level of security access that NATO has. When I was assigned to the War Room, I learned that a study had been initiated in 1961, and everybody was talking about it. They were gossiping about it. And the subject was UFOs, and that intrigued me a bit. When that study was concluded in 1964 and it was published, and I was still working in the War Room at that time, I had access to this document. I had a chance to read it. And having been exposed to it, I must tell you honestly that my life has never ever quite been the same. Because I read first-hand reports, verifiable NATO military material that indicated that the UFOs were not only real, that they represented something far beyond anything I had ever imagined before. When the study was concluded in '64, they concluded that there were 4 different groups apparently coming and visiting us. Out of those 4 different groups, one group looked exactly like we do, so much so that they could sit beside you in a restaurant or in an airplane or in a theater, and you'd never know. And that particular point bothered the military guys a lot. The point being that some of these people from somewhere could be walking up and down the corridors of SHAPE headquarters, or they could be walking up and down the corridors of the Pentagon. One day at lunch, a lieutenant colonel made the remark, he says, "Jesus, do you realize they could even be in the White House?" And there was a little forced laughter at that point, I remember, because a lot of us over the years have had some misgivings about the occupants of the White House. But the point I'm making is that the idea that aliens could be here in our midst bothered the military, because if you're not paranoid when you go into the service, you're certainly trained very quickly to be so. It's the nature of the military mind, I think, to be paranoid. But that was only part of the story. The SHAPE conclusions in '64 were that there were 4 groups that we knew of. They were apparently interplanetary. Some very likely were interstellar. They even concluded that some of them could be intergalactic. When I retired in 1976, many of our military people knew at that point that we were not simply dealing with visitations from people from other planets or star systems. They had concluded by '76 that some of these visitors very well might be multidimensional in their source. I guess I speak out openly and bluntly about this because I feel so strongly about it. I violate my security oath every time I speak about it. I do it intentionally, and I do it on purpose, because I feel so strongly that the American people not only have a right to know the truth, but they have a need to know the truth. The truth, Don, apparently is simply this, that we're not alone, we've never been alone. We are apparently part of an infinite universe filled with intelligent life.
In Dean's 27-year distinguished military career, he served at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, where he witnessed these documents while serving under the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Dean claimed, "The group at the time, there were just 4 that they knew of for certain, and the Greys were one of those groups. There was a group that looked exactly like we do. There was a human group that looked so much like us that they really drove the admirals and generals crazy because they determined that these people, and they had seen them repeatedly, they had had contact with them. There had been abductions. There had been contacts." 2 other groups. There was a very large group. I say large, they were 6 to 8, maybe, sometimes 9 feet tall, and they were humanoid, but they were very pale, very white, didn't have any hair on their bodies at all. And then there was another group that had sort of a reptilian quality to them. We had encountered them. Military people and police officers all over the world have run into these guys. They had vertical pupils in their eyes, and their skin seemed to have a quality very much like what you find on the stomach of a lizard. Given the intensity of the Cold War, the national security officials present may well have decided it was more prudent to seek better terms before agreeing to the extraterrestrials' request. Light's testimony implies that the meeting at Edwards did not result in an agreement, but instead resulted in intense disagreement between Eisenhower officials. By all accounts, the February 20th and 21st, 1954 meeting was not successful, and the extraterrestrials were spurned due to their refusal to enter into technology exchanges and insistence on nuclear disarmament by the U.S. and presumably other major world powers. Cooper describes the circumstances of a subsequent agreement that was reached after the failure of the first meeting. While Cooper has a different version of dates and times for the 1954 meetings, he agrees that there were 2 sets of meetings involving different extraterrestrials meeting with President Eisenhower and/or Eisenhower administration officials. Later in 1954, the race of large-nosed gray aliens, which had been orbiting the Earth, landed at Holloman Air Force Base. A basic agreement was reached. This race identified themselves as originating from a planet around a red star in the constellation of Orion, which we called Betelgeuse. They stated that their planet was dying, and that at some unknown future time, they would no longer be able to survive there. The meeting at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico has reportedly been the site of subsequent extraterrestrial meetings with the same extraterrestrials. Cooper explained the terms of the 1954 treaty reached with the gray extraterrestrials as follows. The treaty stated that the aliens would not interfere in our affairs and we would not interfere in theirs. We would keep their presence on Earth a secret. They would furnish us with advanced technology and would help us in our technological development. They would not make any treaty with any other Earth nation. They could abduct humans on a limited and periodic basis for the purpose of medical examination and monitoring of our development, with the stipulation that the humans would not be harmed, would be returned to their point of abduction, would have no memory of the event, and that the alien nation would furnish Majesty 12, MJ-12, with a list of all human contacts and abductees on a regularly scheduled basis. Another whistleblower source for a treaty having been signed is Phil Schneider, a former geological engineer that was employed by corporations contracted to build underground bases, working extensively on black projects involving extraterrestrials. He revealed his own knowledge of the treaty in the following. Back in 1954, under the Eisenhower administration, the federal government decided to circumvent the Constitution of the United States and form a treaty with alien entities. It was called the 1954 Grenada Treaty, which basically made the agreement that the aliens involved could take a few cows and test their implanting techniques on a few human beings, but that they had to give details about the people involved. Schneider's knowledge of the treaty would have come with his familiarity with a range of compartmentalized black projects and interaction with other personnel working with extraterrestrials. Significantly, a number of whistleblowers argue that the treaty that was signed involved some compulsion on the part of the extraterrestrials. Don Phillips is a former Air Force serviceman, an employee on clandestine aviation projects, who testified having seen documents describing the meeting between President Eisenhower and extraterrestrials, and the background to a subsequent agreement. We have records from 1954 that were meetings between our own leaders of this country and ETs here in California, and as I understand it from the written documentation, we were asked if we would allow them to be here and do research. I have read that our reply was, "Well, how can we stop you? You are so advanced," and I will say by this camera and this sound that it was President Eisenhower that had this meeting. Colonel Philip Corso, a highly decorated officer that served in Eisenhower's National Security Council, alluded to a treaty signed by the Eisenhower administration with extraterrestrials in his memoirs. He wrote, "We had negotiated a kind of surrender with them, extraterrestrials, as long as we couldn't fight them. They dictated the terms because they knew what we most feared was disclosure." Corso's claim of a negotiated surrender suggests that some sort of agreement or treaty was reached, which he was not happy with. According to Cooper, the gray extraterrestrials signing the treaty were not trustworthy. By 1955, it became obvious that the aliens had deceived Eisenhower and had broken the treaty. It was suspected that the aliens were not submitting a complete list of human contacts and abductees to the Majesty 12, and it was suspected that not all abductees had been returned. Similarly, Lear argued that the gray extraterrestrials quickly broke the treaty and could not be trusted. A deal was struck that in exchange for advanced technology from the aliens, we would allow them to abduct a very small number of persons, and we would periodically be given a list of those persons abducted. We got something less than the technology we bargained for, and found the abductions exceeded by 1,000,000-fold than what we had naively agreed to. Other whistleblowers also suggested that the extraterrestrials who signed the treaty with Eisenhower could not be trusted. Schneider claimed that despite the treaty's provisions on the number of humans who would be abducted for experiments, the aliens altered the bargain until they decided they wouldn't abide by it at all. As mentioned earlier, Colonel Philip Corso similarly believed that the extraterrestrials that the Eisenhower administration entered into agreements with could not be trusted. Corso believed the forced negotiated surrender suggested an extraterrestrial agenda that was suspect. While General Douglas MacArthur didn't directly mention any government treaty with extraterrestrials, he gave a famous warning in October 1955, suggesting that some extraterrestrial presence existed that threatened human sovereignty. "You now face a new world, a world of change. We speak in strange terms of harnessing the cosmic energy of ultimate conflict between a united human race and the sinister forces of some other planetary galaxy. The nations of the world will have to unite, for the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of the Earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets." MacArthur may well have been alluding to the same extraterrestrials that Corso, Cooper, and Lear believed had entered into an agreement with the Eisenhower administration. Significantly, reports of contacts with extraterrestrials began to change once the alleged treaty began to be implemented. The friendly Space Brothers reports involving contactees of the 1950s changed as reports of abductions began to emerge after the first recorded case in 1961 involving Barney and Betty Hill. Another apparent pattern that has occurred in ufology is the dominance of the Space Brothers of the 1950s who were kind, interacted with people who became known as contactees, and took people for rides in their spacecrafts. This pattern changed dramatically with the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill in the early 1960s. Due to the official secrecy policy adopted towards the extraterrestrial presence, it may be concluded that some, if not most, of the controversy surrounding these individuals has been caused by military intelligence agencies intent on discrediting whistleblower or witness testimonies. While there continues to be uncertainty caused by the controversy surrounding whistleblower testimonies and the role of military intelligence agencies in generating this controversy, the bulk of evidence points to a first contact meeting having occurred during Eisenhower's Palm Spring vacation on February 20th and 21st, 1954. The testimonies suggest that the extraterrestrials in the first contact event, a race of tall, Nordic extraterrestrials, were spurned due to their reluctance to provide advanced technology in an agreement. A subsequent meeting and treaty was then signed with a different set of extraterrestrials, commonly called Greys, who did not have the same reluctance in exchanging extraterrestrial technology as part of an agreement. Most of the available evidence that has found its way into the public arena suggests that the extraterrestrial race with whom the treaty was signed, the Greys, are at best an enigma, and at worst simply untrustworthy in their treatment of abducted civilians. The subsequent shift in witness reports from friendly extraterrestrial contacts to disturbing abductions suggests that the Eisenhower administration had signed a treaty with extraterrestrials whose motivations and activities were an enigma as far as the general public interest was concerned. The activities of the Grey extraterrestrials apparently continues to raise uncertainty for U.S. national security agencies in terms of an appropriate strategic response. On the contrary, the friendly Nordic Space Brothers faded from the scene since the Eisenhower administration saw them as not sufficiently motivated to serve the technological and strategic goals of U.S. national security agencies. The question of when disclosure of the treaty signed by Eisenhower and of the extraterrestrial presence might occur is one that has long been anticipated. According to Craig Capitas, who covered the World Economic Forum at Davos, Switzerland back in 2004, world leaders discussed extraterrestrials at one or more closed sessions. In a story published on January 21, 2004, Capitas claimed that Forum officials maintain their 5-day program on partnering for security and prosperity requires an unambiguous examination of extraterrestrial presence on Earth. This has been another SBT story. Tell us what you thought of this story in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and sign up for notifications so you know when the next video drops here on our channel. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve White. Until next time.